And dear Strindbergians, I have a subtitle. I really not going to speak about Strindbergs författarskap. I'm going to speak about Strindberg in Sweden and in the world, or the Swedish Strindberg and the international Strindberg. As in Sweden, he's, as we all know, considered the most Swedish of all Swedish writers. But at the same time, he's also the most international of all Swedish writers. And his drama, Miss Julie, now is said to be the most performed play in the world. And I found this drama also very Swedish, but there are many paradoxes, and it would be very easy to continue to call attention to further national and international paradoxes of this kind. And he lived and worked almost for half of his professional working life abroad. Restlessly, he took up residence in one part of Europe after another: France, Switzerland, Denmark, Austria, and Germany. And one of his objectives, of course, was to conquer the world as a writer. If he could bring the world to submission, Sweden would also fall at his feet. The cultural capital of the world at that time was Paris, and if that elegant city fell, then maybe rustic, elusive Stockholm might also be induced to open its arm to him. In 1892, he moved to Berlin, and international success became discernible. His works were translated at an ever faster rate. His dramas Miss Julie, Creditors, and The Father were performed in Paris, and he triumphed. He was the first Swedish dramatist to be performed in the capital of theater, and the French objections were raised against this, what they called invasion of the Scandinavian barbarians. The writer who was perhaps the most Swedish of all our writers came to belong to the world. The man who revitalized the Swedish language also became a vitalizer of word drama. But there was a very long way to go. In Copenhagen in 1889, Miss Julie was to have its world premiere, but the censor intervened with a ban, and the Swedish publisher had refused to print the drama. As for the Swedish opening night, Strindberg had to wait 16 years. And the critics had already dismissed this work, as in the book of it, not the play, as one big mistake, written in a, I quote, language that is scarcely used anywhere but in dens of intoxication and iniquity. It was possible to stage The Father in Berlin in 1890, but only to a private audience at the Freie Bühne in the city. However, once again, the censor stepped in and prohibited further performances. Strindberg had now gained a reputation as a Swedish sensationalist, and his ideas were sort of to resemble those of the banned German Social Democratic Party. At the Swedish premiere in 1888, the reviewers had quoted Hamlet, "Oh, horrible, most horrible." The Dance of Death was written in 1900, but its opening night had to wait until 1909, and then took place at his own theater, the small intimate theater in Stockholm. A leading critic wrote, I quote again, "This Dance of Death is a coarse, plodding, and dull clug dance, capable of neither moving nor captivating its audience." If we move forward to the 1920s, in 1928, there was a storm in the French theater life. Strindberg's A Dream Play, directed by Antonin Artaud, was played at the Théâtre Alfred Jarry in Paris. And hardly had the curtain risen before the audience began to disturb the performance by whistling and shouting. Verbal and guttural exchanges soon escalated into regular close combat. The reason was that the surrealists, led by André Breton, wished to protest against Artaud's aesthetics of the cruelty. And the police once again had to intervene, and 5 angry surrealists were dragged away. And very briefly, this is the stage history of 4 of Strindberg's drama that effected a revolution in word drama. Police intervention, censorship, banning, and uncomprehending criticism from the most varied standpoints long cast shadows over his work, both in his homeland and abroad. The reasons were political, religious, aesthetic, or moral. And Strindberg's naturalist's play, where he tried to become the Zola of drama, dealing with the relationship between man and woman, individual, family, and society, left their mark on American playwrights such as Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, and Edward Albee, as well as the young, angry men of Great Britain, John Osborne, Arnold Wesker, and Harold Pinter. O'Neill stated very solemnly when he received his Nobel Prize in 1936, I quote, "I'm only too proud of my debt to Strindberg. For me, he remains, as Nietzsche remains in his sphere, the master, still to this day more modern than any of us, still our leader." Paradoxically, Strindberg's Dance of Death would also stimulate both form and theme of Jean-Paul Sartre's play Huis clos, No Exit. And from Strindberg's history plays, there is a pretty straight line from, for example, his drama Gustav Adolf, the Mutter Courage und ihre Kinder, Mother Courage, and the epic theater of Bertolt Brecht. And Strindberg's expressionist symbolist plays are the foundation of the theater of the absurd. And they ranged over a very broad international perspective, and from Paris exerted influence over the entire literary avant-garde. The Frenchman Albert Camus, by the way, one of the founders of the French Strindberg Society, and Jean Genet, the Irishman Samuel Beckett, the Russian Arthur Adamov, the Romanian Eugene Ionescu, and the Pole Witold Gombrowicz. And the Swiss playwright Friedrich Dürrenmatt proclaims, I quote, "Modern drama starts with the second act of Strindberg's The Ghost Sonata," end quote. And he is here, of course, referring to how Rhapsody's main characterization, showing but not arguing about the absurdity of man's condition and the transformation of metaphor into scenic reality, created a new and revolutionary dramaturgy. And Rhapsody's strong criticism of the role of language, how language is used not to communicate but to hide behind, is also a Strindbergian heritage. Furthermore, Strindberg and the modern Rhapsodist agree that words can be used as weapons and a way to kill. The student in Strindberg's The Ghost Sonata murders the young lady just by talking to her. In Ionesco's La Leçon, the lesson, the professor does the same when he repeats the words couteau, 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 the knife, knife, knife in front of his defenseless female pupil. And the Rhapsodists were not only influenced by Strindberg, they were stimulated and tried to compete with him, skillfully using the master's own weapons. Thus, Samuel Beckett's Endgame is not only a grateful greeting to the old Swedish patriarch of Rhapsodism, it can also be seen as a productive, almost Freudian parricide. Beckett's character Ham is a radicalized version of Strindberg's Hummel. Maybe both protagonists are successors to the son Ham, who in the Bible was cursed by his father Noah. And Beckett's pessimistic worldview attempts to be even more pessimistic than Strindberg's. Strindberg, furthermore, exerts influence on the world through the films of his compatriot Ingmar Bergman, who strongly identified with him and greatly admire him. We'll hear more about this Strindberg-Bergman relation later in the conference. It's also worth to note that the two contemporary Swedish dramatists who have achieved international renown, Lars Norén and P.O. Enquist, both have a deep relationship with Strindberg. In Norén's early works, the connection with Strindberg's naturalist drama is evident. In Enquist's most well-known play, The Knights of the Tributes, is Strindberg's method of suggestively mixing life, letters, and literature fruitfully developed. Strindberg's impact on word drama, however, does not start with the 20th century. It's also important to pay attention to his rivalry with the Norwegian Henrik Ibsen. the other great Scandinavian 19th century dramatist. It can be noted that in this dramatic competition was embedded an extremely productive dialogue. Strindberg made many of his plays into answers to questions raised by Ibsen. The Father, as well as The Pelican, can in different ways be considered a reply to Ibsen's The Dollhouse and Ghosts. At the same time, Ibsen, in his drama, dwells on themes, structures, and content in Strindberg's play. Hedda Gabler is, for example, an ambiguous comment on his Swedish colleagues, the Father and Miss Julie. It took time, both for Ibsen and Strindberg, before they triumphed on the stage. But when the Norwegian found his dramatic form, he, so to say, stuck to it. Strindberg, however, always kept reinventing himself. His readers and audiences had hardly become accustomed to his dramatic form before he introduced a new one. And Strindberg, for example, had already written Miss Julie by the time the play of his youth, Master Olof, finally was met with acclaim. And Miss Julie, as written in 1888, as I said earlier, it had to wait until 1906 before it had its opening night in Sweden. By that time, Strindberg had already written to Damascus and would shortly begin working on these chamber plays. When the Royal Dramatic Theatre's new building at Nybroplan was inaugurated in 1908, it was with Strindberg's Master Olof, written almost 40 years earlier. And I think this is important. Strindberg and his time were never synchronized. He only became recognized in his own country, that is Sweden, shortly before his death, when he was celebrated with a torchlights procession and a national subscription. But, very ironically, this was due to dramatic and literary works written a long time ago, and not to the newest contributions, not to the chamber plays, and not to the blue books. And besides, that's also important, only about half of the country was behind him. Swedish linguists date the birth of modern written Swedish language to Strindberg's novel The Red Room, as written in 1879. But his prose, also the style of which to us, to his compatriots, is unmistakable, has not, as his drama, conquered the world. Not yet, at least, it might be wise to add. New excellent translations of his works are constantly being published. Still, Strindberg's prose had an important impact, in particular on German literature. Franz Kafka is here the most interesting example. And scholars have stated that Kafka's representative narrative technique, where everything is seen from the hero's, or rather the anti-hero's point of view, in spite of the fact that the story is told in the third person, that is he, and not instead of I, had a strong relation to Strindberg's novel By the Open Sea. Furthermore, both Strindberg's and Kafka's all-knowing narrator knows everything about the inside of their anti-heroes, but absolutely nothing about the other characters. One could also compare the mummy in the closet in Strindberg's The Ghost Sonata with the young Gregor Samsa in Kafka's well-known short story Die Verwandlung, as the Metamorphosis. The old lady in Strindberg's drama is not metaphorically depicted as a mummy or even as a parrot. She is turned into one. In the same way, the unfortunate Samsa, the short story, does not wake up on a bad day feeling like a miserable and clumsy beetle. He is literally transformed into one. And I quote Kafka from his diary in 1915. It's an interesting quote, and I'm not really sure how you should interpret it. I will just read it. My condition is better since I have read Strindberg. I am reading him not to read him, but to be able to lie at his chest. He holds me like a child on his left arm. I am sitting there as a man on a statue. 10 times I'm in the danger of falling down, but at the 11th attempt I sit steadily. I am secure and I have a great view. End quote. And thus the German literary absolutist prose tradition, also strongly descending from Kafka, of course, Elias Canetti, Thomas Bernhardt, and many others, also had its roots in Kafka. And one of Bernhard's stage characters, he asks very provocatively in one of his plays, "Kennen Sie Strindberg? Das ist ein Mann, alles andere ist nicht. Do you know Strindberg? That is a man, no one else is." And it's more difficult. This was history, it was mostly the 19th and 20th century. It is, of course, much more difficult to, with any certainty, state something about the importance of Strindberg for contemporary word literature and contemporary word drama. Partly, of course, because the literary canon and even the revolutionary canon, even Strindberg, revolutionary Strindberg is a part of canon today, of course, and canon is becoming more and more marginalized, and partly because we lack sufficient overview, we don't know yet. But by way of illustration, one can, for example, compare the substantial response provided to a questionnaire from the Strindberg Society to leading international authors in 1949, the centenary of Strindberg's birth, with a similar enquete 50 years later in 1999. And the last one, the result wasn't very impressive. But in 1949, many were very enthusiastic about Strindberg's unquestionable importance. And writers who answered were, for example, Albert Camus, Max Brod, Roger Martin Dugard, André Gide, and Hermann Hesse. And Gide is answering that Strindberg was one of the grand leaders de l'humanité, one of the great leaders of humanity. And Thomas Mann, also in the same fashion of speaking, Strindberg's influence, the moral and the artistic, can only be compared with that of Tolstoy. And if we take a big jump to this year, 2012, a new centenary, if we compare with Ibsen, of course, he is internationally played much more than Strindberg. We can't do anything about it. But maybe we can find comfort, if we have to compete, in that Strindberg maybe is a writer for writers and a dramatist for dramatists. And I'll give you two contemporary examples, how Strindberg still continues to play an important role for the international artistic avant-garde. Firstly, for the world of film and the Danish film director Lars von Trier. And secondly, for the world of drama, an example of the playwright Sarah Kane, one of the most important British post-war dramatists. And Lars von Trier, if you go the way images and guilt are chained together in his film Antichrist, 2009, a very new film, is, according to the director's own statement, modern upon the way Strindberg literary is constructing his crisis in the novel Inferno. But to me, it's also quite obvious that von Trier's film, his earlier film, Dogville, in 2003, has a metadramatical structure totally built upon Strindberg's dream play. The plot is cruelly and ironically mirroring Strindberg's drama. Grace, that's the female protagonist of the film, and she's not, as Strindberg's protagonist, the daughter of a god, in spite of Grace's biblical and religious name, Grace, but she's a daughter of a common gangster boss. When Grace has visited the little American village, she disappears in the car of her father, just as the daughter of Indra returns to her father in heaven. And both von Trier's film and Strindberg's play end in the same way, with a purifying fire, albeit of a very different character, of course. And even I won't go into detail, but even the male characters who meet the daughter in the film seem to mirror the different male figures in Strindberg's drama. For example, the amateur writer Tom corresponds very well to the poet of Strindberg's drama, the faithful family father Chuck to the lawyer of the drama, and the young masochist boy Jason to the optimistic officer. Sarah Kane, in her turn, her shocking so-called theater of the extreme, with a very vitriolic blend of violence, sexual desire, torture, and death, has strong links to Strindberg. And in her drama, cleansed the spatial construction with an outside and an inside, gives strong echoes of the rooms in the Ghost Sonata as places for discovery and revelation, stations of pilgrimage, much used in the same way as Strindberg did. And if you look at contemporary Scandinavian literature, there are furthermore many examples. And then I go back to the prose, that the way which Strindberg used autofiction in, for example, The Son of a Servant, has given inspirations to writers such as Karl Ove Knausgård, Maja Lundgren, och Carina Rydberg. And the subject I've chosen for today is Strindberg and the Word. I would underline one other important point. Strindberg's scholarship and Strindberg's stage history in Sweden were very long formed by our extensive knowledge of Strindberg's personal life. The emphasis was always on biography and on the question from where Strindberg derived his material. In this context, foreign countries, which have not in the same manner been marked by this knowledge, have greatly helped to renew and deepen the picture, our picture. And the German-Austrian director, Max Reinhardt, for example, he convincingly demonstrated at the time of the First World War that Strindberg's chamber plays, which in Sweden mostly had been ridiculed or even become a laughing stock, indeed were playable. And already in the 1920s, a specifically Swedish Strindberg tradition was established, both in scholarship and on stage. And Reinhardt's productions of the Ghost Sonata and the Dream Play, guest performances in Sweden, stimulated in Germany a Strindberg scholarship, which resulted in a series of psychopathographies, giving him different psychiatric diagnoses. And I think this in Sweden contributed to a strong Swedish counter-reaction. Martin Lamm, we could call him the father of Strindberg scholarship. He emphasized the question of from where Strindberg got his material and his inspiration, not how he dealt with it artistically. He placed Strindberg in a specifically Swedish context. And Strindberg's biography and his geographic surroundings were also used by Olof Molander. Those two gentlemen were intimately working together. Martin Lamm literally sent Molander letters with biographical information. And this to make Strindberg more Swedish and also more normal. In Sweden, it seems to me that the interest in the person, August Strindberg, he was born in 1849 and died in 1912, has always been at least as great as the interest in his works. And this real Strindberg, whoever he is, has successfully competed with all his fictional characters. And in public discussions in media, etc., it seems like one doesn't even make the distinction between those two fields. And it's also obvious that plays and novels written about Strindberg still continue to fascinate the Swedish audiences and readers. The inventor of the world-famous Swedish police investigator Wallander, Henning Mankell, has just a short while ago published 9 one-actors on Strindberg. And Strindberg's wives are furthermore giving new life or take their late revenge in novels. And Strindberg himself makes his entry dressed in his usual hat, the hair tousled as it should be, and with moustache and beard illusory glued on the actor's face by the skillful make-up man. And Strindberg's use of his own life to create art captivated, thrilled, and shocked his contemporary readers and audiences. In our time, where the craving for reality more and more poses a threat to fiction, this tendency can be easily understood. And the Swedish Strindberg has become some kind of a living myth. His face is recognized by everyone, and all Swedes seem to hold their own strong opinion. Particularly on memorial days and jubilees, old cliches reappear in media almost automatically, positive as well as negative ones, all in fact dating back to the great Strindberg feud in 1910 to 12. And he's still the madman, the great hater, the misogynist, or the writer of the people. The world, on the other hand, has always been more interested in Strindberg, the dramatist, and has discovered themes and structures in Strindberg which the Swedes have had difficulties to see. And the world suffers with Miss Julie, notwithstanding its ignorance of the Swedish way of celebrating midsummer and the Swedish system of agricultural labor, and traditional Lutheran remorse for one's sins, sexual anxiety, and attacks on the cult of motherhood have not prevented the Pelican from becoming a very, very widely performed play in Catholic Italy. And one last example, Strindberg's play on the Swedish King Charles XII, Karl XII, was in Sweden criticized for its anachronism and lack of heroism. But when the drama was staged in the US in the 1950s, the critics were stunned. They didn't know, the American critics, of course, they didn't know anything about the Swedish hero king, and probably thought that this taciturn and mysterious man on stage was some kind of a soulmate to Shakespeare's King Lear or Alfred Jarry's Ubu Roi. Thus, they were surprised to correctly discover that the play's main theme, a man waiting for his death, was nothing else than Beckett 50 years before Beckett. In Strindberg's case, the all-labeling attempts of literary historians and drama theorists easily result in didactic simplifications. Strindberg was, on the one hand, constantly running counter to his contemporaries, always out of sync. On the other, all ism of the 19th century, Darwinism, nihilism, socialism, realism, naturalism, Nietzscheanism, symbolism, etc., found in Strindberg, as in very few, if any, contemporary fellow authors, a hotbed. His ideals were, however, hardly formulated before they were abandoned. Equally faithless is Strindberg, the artist, to the theorist or propagandist of the same name. And yes, I'll just take one example, since we're going to have Miss Julie on stage. Her father's boots are already there in two pairs of them. It's very easy to find evidence in Strindberg's articles, essays, letters that he was a misogynist. But it becomes much more difficult to do so in his dramatical works. In the preface to Miss Julie, Strindberg writes that he wants to describe a half-woman or an Amazon. But, of course, the Miss Julie of the play and her demands for sexual rights and equality is something quite different. Her dream of wanting to see shanks, sex, I quote, swim in a lake of blood, end quote, rather leads our thoughts to the radical feminism of our own times, maybe even to Valerie Solanas and her scum society for cutting up men. Furthermore, Solanas' text is written with almost the same thundering energy, with the same effective mixture of truth and insaneness that often was a mark of Strindberg's propagandistical prose. Meanwhile, or finally, Strindberg is, as I try to state, a timeless writer, as the new experiences and isms of the 20th and the 21st century has proved. And I won't mention all the isms of the 20th century, but it's obvious that the isms of our own time, the gender and queer studies and ecology, also will discover new aspects of Strindberg. And I end by once more quoting his pupil Franz Kafka. We are all Strindberg's contemporaries and successors. Thank you.